Welcome back to the Real Life Theology Podcast. This is your host, Matthew Croson. Today we get to feature one of our Renew.org authors, Jeremy Bacon. Jeremy Bacon will take us on a journey through the Sermon on the Mount, sharing how this familiar passage challenged his views and revealed a deeper call to heart transformation, not just rules. Jeremy helps us see the sermon as a blueprint for living in God's kingdom. Let's dive in.
We're probably going to go and get started. We got a pretty full room, so that's good. I think most of the people that are going to work their way here have found their way here. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. I really can't express how much I appreciate that, not choosing to just go get a long lunch or something. We're gonna jump straight into it because we have a lot of ground to cover. We're talking about the Sermon on the Mount this morning. And I don't know if you're like me. Approaching the Sermon on the Mount, I kind of ambivalent. This whole project for me started as I was preparing for a teaching trip. I was going to do some Bible training for a group of Maasai pastors in southern Kenya. And my idea, I think I am. Yeah, I'm going to shut the door. They'll interrupt me and I'll interrupt them, and that's not going to work. So I was preparing for this teaching trip, and my idea was to do just some basic Bible interpretation lessons. You just run the guys through just the basic nuts and bolts of hermeneutics, that kind of thing. You all right?
I'm going to get a count.
Okay. Sorry, I'm an inventory controller in my day job, and I'm like, oh, I can count. No, not what I'm doing today. My idea for teaching these guys was to pick one text, so like a chapter or maybe a series of chapters, and that would just be our working text for the whole week, and I would illustrate all the principles of interpretation from that one text. What text to do? Well, I mean, the Sermon on the Mount just kind of obviously suggests itself. But like I said, I kind of felt ambivalent about that. I mean, on the one hand, okay, this is Jesus' most famous sermon. So yeah, it's got to be important, right? On the other hand, it just feels like it's been done to death. And also, and maybe this is just me, depraved man that I am, but I'm like, but the Sermon on the Mount, it's got a lot of weird tangential stuff about like keeping oaths and anger management. I mean, is that what exegesis? That's what we're going to dig into? So I had mixed feelings, but the Sermon on the Mount won out. So I memorized it, started just analyzing it, picking it apart, just kind of dissecting it, trying to understand it. And it wasn't long before I started realizing that as I dug into the Sermon on the Mount, or rather as it dug into me, I had barely done the Sermon on the Mount at all. I mean, so maybe it's appropriate that from what I'm told, we are in a kindergartner's room this morning. In order to actually understand what Jesus was saying, not only did I have to let the Sermon on the Mount critique the way I lived, which it most definitely did that, I had to let it critique my entire worldview. I mean, in order to simply understand what Jesus is saying, I needed to see reality the way he does. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to tear everything down and then hopefully build it back up again. That sound good?
Awesome.
Okay, 45 minutes. We can do this. All right. So where to start? I'm going to start with just a quick thing I just threw out almost to the side of letting the Sermon on the Mount critique the way I live. One way you can frame the Sermon on the Mount legitimately, you can frame the Sermon on the Mount as a portrait of the character of a disciple. That alone should get our attention, because I mean, the huge undercurrent for this conference, for Renew in general, is all disciple making. Well, here's Jesus saying, this is what we're trying to make. So look at the setting in chapters 5, verses 1 and 2. Jesus sees the crowds. He knows the crowds are there, and he wants them to hear what he's saying. But first and foremost, he is directly teaching his disciples. They're the ones he's talking to. And it's as though Jesus is telling his followers, this is what the life of one of my followers looks like. Now, if you've been in the business for any amount of time, you know that that take on the Sermon on the Mount can already be controversial in some circles. There's a very famous take on the Sermon on the Mount that basically says, yes, this is stuff people should do, but they can't. I mean, seriously. Right, this is common. In fact, there's a very famous illustration of an English teacher at just some secular university who assigned the Sermon on the Mount to her class as just, literature, just a reading assignment, write a reflection on this famous piece of writing. And her students' papers basically came back, this is impossible, you can't do this, religion is so ridiculous, no one can do this. And often, when preachers use that illustration, they say that the students were right. That what Jesus is saying is impossible. And that in fact, the impossibility is the point. And so in that context, they're preaching salvation by grace through faith. And so the logic would go, we have to realize that we can't be good enough. And so what Jesus does is he pushes us there by giving us an impossible standard. Now, if you want to preach salvation by grace through faith, that's great. But the problem with this impossibility theory is that it says the exact opposite of what Jesus himself actually says in the sermon. If Jesus is pretty good with words. If he wanted to say, you can't be good enough, I don't think he'd need 3 chapters to say it. He'd probably just tell a catchy story and move on. Instead, what he gives us are 3 chapters full of imperatives. Do this, don't do this. I mean, in fact, what is the famous concluding paragraph for this sermon? The wise man, hearing the word doesn't count for anything. The wise man is the one who hears these words and does them. So, if our theology concludes the exact opposite of what Jesus is saying, that's a good sign that we need to pull off the road, stop the car, we need to check the map, turn on our GPS, we got off course somewhere. So, the dilemma we're dealing with here is a dilemma that Dietrich Bonhoeffer frames famously well. It's the dilemma between legalism, you have to be good enough, and what he calls cheap grace. Grace that says, don't worry, you're good. Grace that doesn't ask anything of us, doesn't call us to anything, and doesn't transform anyone. Neither of those sides of the dilemma are acceptable. The way out of this dilemma between legalism and cheap grace is to realize that both horns of that dilemma assume that the Sermon on the Mount, and indeed Christianity in general, is all about rules. Of course, legalism assumes it's all about rules. They're like, yeah, it's about rules and you have to keep the rules. But cheap grace also assumes it's all about rules. It just says, yes, it's about rules, but Jesus kept the rules for you, so you're good. But what if Jesus' whole point is that it's not about rules at all? What if he's trying to say that the entire rules-based paradigm is wrong? If only we had stories in the Gospels of Jesus interacting with people who almost like personally embodied the rules-based paradigm, and we could see how he related to them. Oh, right, we do. In fact, he mentions them in the Sermon on the Mount. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of God. Kingdom of heaven in that verse. So, let me find the spot. Okay. Elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul may talk about an imputed righteousness that is attributed to us, but let's let Jesus be Jesus and Paul be Paul. They may not necessarily be at the same point in the conversation here. Remember, in Jesus' sermon, this is a sermon full of imperatives, a sermon full of things he's telling us to do. When Jesus talks about righteousness, he is talking about an actually lived out righteousness, one that you are wise if you do it, you are a fool if you don't. So this is a lived out righteousness, and it is a lived out righteousness that we are supposed to do better than the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, the point of bringing up the scribes and the Pharisees is that no one can keep rules better than those guys. They were professional rule keepers. So the only way our righteousness can exceed the scribes and the Pharisees is if righteousness is not about rules. If it's about something deeper. And the truth is, it always was. Even in the Old Testament law, the rules were not the thing God was most concerned about. All the stipulations in the Old Testament, every little law, they are meant to point to something else. It's not like when God gave Israel the law, these rules were just arbitrary. God wasn't like, should I make murder right or wrong? Flip a coin. Okay, wrong. No. Even the littlest command in the Torah, all of them are derived from a principle. And all of those principles, trace them back far enough, ultimately derive from the character of God himself. What does the book of Leviticus say over and over? Be holy as I am holy. God gave Israel the law because he wanted them to become like him. But deeper than that, God wants us to become like him because he wants us to know him. What does Jesus say in John 17? This is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. A lot of times when we talk about the kingdom, we're approaching it like this is some kind of transactional relationship. Like we're in an open-air marketplace and it's just one of the things a vendor has on his table. And the only questions we're asking is, how much does this thing cost and who's going to pay for it? Isn't that often how we present the gospel? How much does this thing cost and who's going to pay for it? And that's all we ask. Meanwhile, God is there going, I'm not trying to sell you a product. I'm trying to give you me. I want you to know me. And so Jesus fulfills the law by transforming our heart into God's heart. Sorry. I had it for a second, I lost it. There it is. Yeah, transforming our heart into God's heart. And he points to that in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Why? For they will be called sons of God. Mm-hmm. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? So that you may become like your Father in heaven. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, you be like God. So as promised, we've zoomed way out. And what I'm saying is we often have a mistaken understanding of the Sermon on the Mount because we have a mistaken understanding of Christianity itself. Christianity is not a transaction. It is a relationship. Now, as soon as I use that word, you go, oh, right, yes, we know this. The saying is ubiquitous. Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. What I'm saying is that the way that relationship grows is by us letting God transform our heart into His heart. That is what Christianity is about. Knowing God more by taking on and living out His heart. And the Sermon on the Mount is what that looks like. So, our first principle for understanding and teaching the Sermon on the Mount, hopefully pretty practical, is for any particular passage you look at, any paragraph, any teaching, don't ask, okay, what's okay here and what's not okay here? That's a rules-based question. That's the wrong paradigm. Instead of asking what's okay, what's not okay, what's the rule, instead ask, what is God's heart here? What is the principle or attitude underlying these imperatives Jesus is giving us? And just another little practical tip. A lot of times these principles will be framed negatively. Don't be like this. If that's the case, flip it. Instead of just looking at the attitude Jesus is warning us against, what's the opposite attitude that Jesus is encouraging us towards? And how does that reflect the heart of God? Once you start asking that question, this sermon absolutely crackles with meaning and relevance. Let's run an example. You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. Anyone who murders is subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Okay, so if we're going to ask, what's the rule? We're going to approach this. Okay, what rule is Jesus laying down? Apparently the rule is anger is bad. And that can't be the rule. I mean, anger is just a feeling. Feelings aren't bad or good. They just are. Okay, so it must be some particular type of anger or some way of handling your anger that's bad. And what way is that? Well, maybe it's encapsulated by the specific word Jesus uses. But then we do our homework and we see that in Ephesians, Paul uses the exact same word when he says, in your anger, do not sin, which creates some space between anger, in the exact sense Jesus said, and sinning, assuming that you can do one without the other. So at this point, if we're looking for the rule, I'm like, I have no idea what the rule is. Apparently, the rule must just be something like, manage your anger well. And so then if we go on to talk about anger management based on this passage, whatever our lesson or sermon may be, it may be really good stuff. It's just not what Jesus is talking about because we couldn't figure out what the rule was. Instead, let's ask, what is God's heart here? What principle is underlying what Jesus is talking about? How does Jesus himself flesh out what he means by, okay, anger, murder? How does Jesus flesh that out? He immediately goes on to talk about name calling. Oh, okay, I'm not really sure where that came from. Okay, name calling. Well, what is name calling? To call someone a pejorative name, the function of doing that is to express contempt. That's why you call somebody a pejorative name, to express contempt for them. Okay, contempt and anger, those usually go together. That kind of makes sense. And what is contempt? It is the act of devaluing someone, of saying that you are less than. Well, in that sense, what is murder except the ultimate expression of contempt? a statement that the value of that life is 0. So what Jesus is saying is name-calling and murder may be on opposite ends of the contempt spectrum, but they are on the same spectrum. Now, if we understand the paragraph that way, the rest of the paragraph actually starts to make a lot more sense. I don't know if you've ever really wrestled through that paragraph and you're like, what does this all have to do with each other? The next the next line in the paragraph, you're taking a sacrifice up to the altar and remember, oh, my brother has something against me. Taking a sacrifice up to the altar is the act of trying to draw near to God. That's it's a statement that I am drawing near to God. But what does John say over and over again? Anyone who says he loves God but hates his brother is a liar. So if you think you're drawing near to God, but you're harboring contempt for your brother instead, Jesus is saying, you better get right with him first, then you draw near to God. And the last part of the paragraph, the guy who owes somebody money and is getting taken to court is reading a little bit between the lines, but surely he knows he owes this guy money. Why doesn't he just pull him aside, negotiate something out, pay up, and be done? Well, if he has contempt for this other guy, his attitude may be, no, I'm not going to negotiate with him. That guy doesn't deserve to get paid. Because contempt distorts the way you see reality. And that attitude may work just fine until you're standing in front of a judge who doesn't have that problem, and you are going to pay every penny. So, if the principle is don't have contempt for your brother, that's negative, flip it. What is the opposite of contempt? The opposite of contempt is respect. So Jesus is encouraging us and showing that the heart of God is to respect and value every human being. Now, we start seeing this paragraph that way. This is no longer some tangential note about anger management. Instead, it is like Jesus is targeting our culture in this moment with some kind of hyper-precision space laser. What message could possibly be more relevant right now than that the heart of God is not to learn to have contempt for the right people, but to get rid of contempt altogether? This is what happens when you stop asking, what's right, what's wrong, what's the rule, and instead start asking, what is God's heart here? So, I started by saying you could frame the Sermon on the Mount as a portrait of the character of a disciple. What we've seen is that character simply is the character of God. And so I think the deepest way to frame the Sermon on the Mount is that it is a presentation of God's heart. Now, there's one other way to frame the Sermon on the Mount that I have to mention, cannot give it enough time, which is shameful, but I need to mention it because it is closest to the language Jesus himself uses. The Sermon on the Mount is also a portrait of life in the kingdom. Now, the kingdom of heaven is what the Sermon on the Mount is about. I mean, from the first beatitude till one of the last warnings in chapter 7, the whole sermon is shot through with language of the kingdom. Sometimes calling it kingdom of heaven, sometimes just calling it the kingdom, sometimes just calling it heaven. In fact, a couple chapters before, when Jesus had to give a one-sentence summary of his entire message, the way Jesus summarized his gospel was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. Side thought, how come that's almost never the way we present the gospel? As the good news that the kingdom has come near. Probably because we're not really sure what that means. Well, in the book that I wrote, I took a chapter to try to exegete out what the kingdom of heaven is. Long story short, skip to the end. The kingdom of heaven is a metaphysical reality. And in Christ, that reality is breaking in. And when that reality touches this broken world, it fixes things. In fact, Matthew brackets chapters 5 through 9 together as a unit. And immediately after the Sermon on the Mount, in chapters 8 and 9, what does Jesus do? He goes and heals a bunch of people. That's the kingdom coming. Jesus is like, the kingdom fixes you, and the kingdom fixes you, and the kingdom fixes you. And so the Sermon on the Mount is what happens when the kingdom reaches in and fixes us. Jesus is saying, this is what a life that is fixed looks like. So the Sermon on the Mount is a portrait of life in the kingdom. A couple other things I should say about that, just to kind of round out the theology a little bit more. This effect of us taking on God's heart, the kingdom touching us, this is unabashedly supernatural. I mean, we're talking about taking on God's heart. That's not something you can do on your own. That's not going to happen. So taking on, having our heart conform to the heart of God is every bit as supernatural as the healings that occur in chapter 8 and 9. It is a work God does in us. And Jesus gives a nod to this in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. Passive voice, it's something that happens to them. They will be filled. On the other hand, as we experience this process of our heart conforming to God's heart, we experience it, first of all, as a growth process. It's not a one and done, you're good. It's a growth process. And secondly, a process that often feels really hard. It feels like really hard work. And again, Jesus gives a nod to this in the Sermon on the Mount. Narrow is the gate, and difficult is the path that leads to life. What is a path but a progressive realization of a goal, and nodding to a growth process? And he uses that word, difficult is the path, implying, yeah, sometimes this is going to feel really hard. But the truth is, the only work we do in all this is abiding in him. John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me and you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So the Sermon on the Mount is not about rules. Instead, what Jesus is doing is he's trying to challenge us with specific areas of our lives where we are not letting the life of Christ flow through. He's trying to say, this is something you haven't surrendered to me yet. And you need to surrender it so my life can flow through you. That's what he's doing in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so as promised, that's our theology worldview revision. And that got us one principle for understanding and teaching the Sermon on the Mount. Don't ask what the rule is, what's okay, what's not okay. Ask, what is God's heart here?
Excellent.
Second principle for understanding and teaching the Sermon on the Mount, we really need to ask for any specific teaching, how does this actually work? Now, asking how does this actually work, I'm not just making a homiletical point. I'm not just saying your sermon or lesson should have application. Duh, we know this. There's a theological point here. There's one commentary I read in this whole process by a reasonably high-name author, actually. And at one point, he basically says, you know what? Some of the stuff Jesus is saying may not work, but Jesus said it, so do it anyway. Now, that is assuming a top-down way of speaking. Maybe you could call it like a prophetic kind of, thus saith the Lord, here's what I'm telling you to do kind of thing. And, okay, to be fair, Jesus definitely is using a prophetic kind of top-down way of speaking in the Sermon on the Mount. For Pete's sake, he's literally standing on a mountain talking down. But there is another way of talking in the Bible that is more ground-level observation, bottom-up way of talking. So instead of prophetic, it is a wisdom literature way of looking at things. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is also, as wisdom literature, I was just, when I think of wisdom literature, I always like to think of some grizzled older guy just going, look, kid, this is just the way the world works. I mean, whether you like it or not, this is just the way it is. I mean, that's wisdom literature. And boy, there's some points in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, honestly, the thing about if you get taken to court, you're going to pay every penny. I mean, that's just practical. Jesus is like, sorry, you're going to end up in trouble. I mean, yeah, it's practical stuff. And so if Jesus is using this wisdom literature way of speaking, then what he's saying should actually work in real life. I mean, well, okay. The last paragraph in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus literally uses the words wise and foolish. I mean, he could not indicate more clearly that he is also dipping into the wisdom literature way of speaking. But this question of, okay, is this a bottom-up way of looking at things, or a bottom-up or a top-down way of looking at things? It is closely related to another theological question, which and it comes up in a lot of, you just did a part on the Beatitudes. This is really clear in the Beatitudes. Are we talking about this life or the next life? Which one? And I really think Jesus just gleefully dances in the ambiguity between that because it's both. Because he wants it to be both. So often it's like, okay, is this bottom-up wisdom? Is it top-down declaration? The answer is yes. Is this talking about this life or is it talking about the next life? The answer is yes. Well, I think one of the best examples is, judge not lest you be judged. Okay, is that a bottom-up wisdom literature, this life kind of statement that if we judge somebody, they're going to turn around and judge us right back? Okay, or is it a bottom or top-down future statement? Be careful judging because there is a greater judgment coming. I think you can make a solid exegetical case in that paragraph for both of those because the answer is it's both. Okay, so if Jesus is using both ways of speaking, when I say a principle for understanding the Sermon on the Mount is to ask, how does this actually work? I'm focusing on the wisdom this life side of things. I'm focusing on that for three reasons. First of all, if what Jesus is saying doesn't make a difference, who cares? The world has had more than enough of a Christianity that doesn't change how anyone lives and doesn't make anything better. It doesn't need any salt that's lost its saltiness. If it doesn't make a difference, who cares? The second point, if it does make a difference, your people need it. I mean, like Jesus says, they are building their house on something. They're either building it on rock or they're building it on sand. And if they're not building their lives on the way of living Jesus presents, they're in trouble. I mean, he explicitly says that at the end of this sermon. Third reason to focus on this life, how does this actually work? There's a hermeneutical point there. If you don't get how Jesus' teachings work now, that may be an indication that you don't really understand what he's saying yet. You need to dig a little bit deeper. And my advice for one place to go digging would be to look for the people who are actually doing this stuff. How are they finding it? How are they doing it? How is it working for them? And that may inform how this actually works. And I will say, because we're talking about a wisdom kind of ground up thing, you don't just have to look at Christians. That's the thing about wisdom. It is generally accessible. Anybody who's honest with themselves and paying enough attention can figure this stuff out. My favorite example of this that I came across in putting together this book had to do with the meek. The way I analyze the meek in the book is that the meek are those who do not control or dominate others. That's meekness. And then, of course, the flip side of meekness would be treating people with respect. So that's why the way I analyze meekness. And then I'm reading, don't ask why, I probably can't even explain why, but I'm reading a police training manual on de-escalation tactics with people who are mentally ill or on drugs. I mean, so we're talking about like the hardest of hardcore situations. These are guys who have zero interest in pretty words and nice ideas. They need to know what works. And one early chapter in that manual is entirely about respect. The whole chapter. In fact, at one point, it literally says in bold print, respect saves lives. And my brain just blows out the back of my head because I realize I am reading about tactical meekness. The stuff works. Okay, third principle, and I barely have time to even mention this one, but we need to focus on both the forest and the trees. You have to do both. I mean, we need the forest perspective. Because like I said, what Jesus is trying to do is challenge us with specific areas that we are not surrendering, where we are not surrendering to Him. Well, if we just fly over the forest at 30,000 feet, there's going to be tons of things we don't even notice, much less be challenged by or changed by. But on the other hand, oh shoot, I said that wrong. That's if we only look at the trees, then you're not going to be challenged or changed by things. But we also do need the forest perspective. Because if we just look at the trees, it's way too easy to fall into that rules-based thinking. We need to have that kingdom of God, kingdom life, heart of God perspective. I wish I had more advice on how to do that. I was just talking with him. His church is spending literally an entire year on the Sermon on the Mount because there's that many trees. I'm not supposed to stand up here and just plug my book, but I mean, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, it's like, okay, I can actually give each tree the attention I want to give if I just write a whole book about it. And I will mention in the book, each chapter has some discussion questions at the end, and I have been told that makes it very easy to adapt for like a small group setting. Real short chapters. In fact, it was actually my writing coach was, as soon as it hit Amazon, he like bought a bunch of copies. And what he did is he would have people in a small group. So one person would just read the chapter out loud, and then they just discuss the questions. And he figured then they could get through about 2 chapters in one session. So that seemed to work pretty well.
How long sessions?
Yeah, for an hour, it worked for him. The chapters are pretty short. That's right. Also, the folks who are new asked if I could put together 6 sermons outlines to try to cover the entire Sermon on the Mount. And I did, and those are free. So it's just on their website under resources and sermon tools. Sermon on the Mount, there they are. And so in those, I try to at least like point out the trees as I'm flying over. But that's something you can use. Okay, based on the time we have, you know what? We may have a couple minutes for questions because I've got one more point. But I think we can ask. Does anybody have any questions?
How much of this talking, this sermon is literal? I mean, what does it mean when he says, "Pluck out your eyes and cut off your hands"?
I think that's.
He's not saying that if you're encouraging you to sin, that you should pluck it out. None of us in here got our eyes plucked.
Right. Yeah. Now that's a fair question. Jesus is he's a big fan of figures of speech. But just because something is a figure of speech doesn't mean it's meaningless. So that's the tricky thing. You may want to say, oh, that's not literal, so I don't need to pay any attention to it. No, that's not how it works. But you can make an exegetical case that Jesus is saying, pluck out your eye is not literal. I think the case is, if you sin with your right eye, how did my left eye not sin at the same time? Was it just not paying attention? No, okay, so it is a figure of speech. But whatever Jesus is pointing to with the figure of speech, he is obviously very serious about it. I mean, that's the point of the illustration. Does that make sense? I like one point in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, he says, we would be better off if we always suspected that it would be best if we literally followed exactly what Jesus is saying. Now, I think of that specifically in the context of the paragraph about turning the other cheek. Because there are times when, boy, it might look like turning the other cheek, but it's not really the right thing to do. Kind of what I talk about in what Jesus is doing in that paragraph is he's saying, okay, there's paying somebody back, there's just giving in to them, but that's not what Jesus says. Jesus doesn't say just give in. He says go an extra mile. Jesus is giving grace to the one who has just insulted you, or because backhanded slap, that's an insult. To one who's just insulted you or degraded you, carry my stuff to another mile. So grace wants to do something to help. Oh, you need to carry your gear to Sepphoris? Fine, I'll help you carry it an extra mile. You need to vent something that you just can't deal with on the inside? I can take it, do that, and then after that, let's see what I can do to help you. Sorry, I work customer service. But enabling an abuser, that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help the people they abuse. There's no grace in doing that. So following the letter of what it looks like Jesus is saying in that instance misses God's heart. So you always go back to what is God's heart here.
Yes.
To help, is that what you're saying?
It's an act of grace to this other person.
What about vulnerability and turning the other cheek? Like, does it teach that grace too?
Oh,
that
sure.
we rely on God and He gives us the strength to be vulnerable?
Absolutely, because in that you can kind of group the different examples Jesus gives, and they basically fall under surrendering your reputation and not holding on to your stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that is everything we're afraid of losing, and Jesus is like, no, don't worry about promoting yourself, don't worry about protecting yourself, I got you. I mean, he goes on to that in chapter 6.
Yeah, which is vulnerability.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
How would you balance the teaching of no wealth? Do not accumulate treasures on earth, because the natural response, not natural, but the traditional response.
Yeah.
Well, of course, if you're rich, just be generous.
Right.
You don't have to literally.
Give
Yeah.
it away. Yeah.
And that's always dismissed. And there are examples of people in history who have taken them quite seriously and they've received them. So I'm just curious.
When I was writing the chapters on those paragraphs, it almost feels like there's a knife edge between overstating Jesus's warnings about money and understating them. And in our culture, I think we see it understated way more because Jesus is not gentle about his warnings about money. So I tried real hard to walk that knife edge. And kind of what I landed on as far as the heart of it is that the problem is money wants to be your master.
Absolutely.
It wants to control you. And so to some extent, you need to recognize that what I'm handling here is kind of dangerous. I give the analogy of radioactive material. If you handle it just right, this can be a healthy, life-giving thing. If you don't, it will kill lots of people. So that's kind of where I go with the money. It's just be wary of it. It cannot be your heart. Now, in wanting to warn people against it, at the end of the day, there's no way, I think in one of the discussion questions, I actually mentioned, you can either, you may want to look at somebody who's just opulent, like I work retail, so I'm like, somebody who can afford a $5,000 fridge. I'm just like, that's absurd, that's obscene. But I've been to Kenya. I mean, I've been in a house that was made of sticks and dirt and cow dung. If they saw my house, they'd be like, this is obscene.
Exactly.
So there is no objective way to measure What is too much? What is enough? You just have to, where is my heart? What God
But that's
am
a
I
rules
serving?
question, isn't it? The last two questions were rules questions.
Yeah, how much is too much?
But-
that's a rules
Right,
question.
so-
Yeah.
So to discuss what's the heart in it, it's, right, isn't that the real question? What's my heart
That's
need to
two
strive
extremes, that's
for?
true.
Yeah, and which is like exactly where
The
Jesus goes. What
generosity,
master
yeah.
do you serve?
What master do you serve?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
All right. This will probably get us out about on time if I go to the one last thing I thought I should say about teaching and understanding the Sermon on the Mount. And this last point, I felt like I should address understanding and teaching the Sermon on the Mount in this particular moment that we're living in.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with story time. There's a friend of mine. He's actually on my team at the store. He works part-time, but his main job is he's on staff at a local church. And I think this story that he told me is a nice microcosm of the moment we're in. So I don't know how he ended up on this text. He probably should have thought more about it. But he found himself very recently teaching on the text where the religious leaders challenged Jesus in the temple, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, like we just said, Jesus is very clear, money is not the master we serve. So in that encounter, of course, his answer is, if Caesar wants his money, give him his money. Who cares? We have bigger fish to fry.
That's good.
And so my friend is teaching this lesson, and he said, you could cut the tension in the air with a knife. And in fact, early on in the lesson, he sees one lady in the crowd close her Bible, zip it shut, and push it to the side. Saying very clearly, if unintentionally, I am not interested in what God has to say on this subject. In an early draft of this talk, for this final point, I was kind of going to rail against ways that a lot of Christians nowadays are living out the opposite of God's heart in this moment. This whole us versus them thing, circle the wagons, we've got to protect ourselves and grab power any way we can to do that. But the truth is, all of those behaviors are just symptoms. Underlying all of that is that our people are terrified.
Yeah.
They are terrified of general things, that somebody's going to take away their rights or their money or their freedoms. But those general fears are undergirded by specific fears. Fears that their own unique life circumstances have taught them. Messages they have taken specifically because of what they've gone through. And they are letting those fears be their king and not Jesus. So they need someone to shepherd them through naming those fears, giving them to Jesus, and then letting him trade them for a kingdom perspective. In this case, the kingdom perspective would be, those are all the things that Gentiles run after. God knows you need them. You don't have to worry about those things. Just seek the kingdom. Now the problem, if we are going to shepherd our people through those things, is that we are terrified too. And all too often, the thing we are terrified of is our own people. My friend said after he taught that lesson, he just sat at home for 3 hours, just staring into space. Occasionally the thought floating through his mind, am I going to have a job next week? He did. So, if we did a survey of all the things Jesus shows about God's heart in the Sermon on the Mount, there are plenty of you who would hear something in that list and go, if I actually taught that at my church, I would either get fired or split my church. That is our general fear. And if we look for the kingdom perspective on that, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would go, yeah, that's the worst case scenario. And if that happens, congratulations, because blessed are those who are persecuted on account of righteousness.
Now you know.
To which we respond, yeah, but. And that but is based on our specific fear. Whatever messages we have taken from our unique life experience. So the last principle for teaching and understanding the Sermon on the Mount, like Jesus says, you need to look at what's in your own eye first. Then you can help your brother. So, what am I worried about? Like me, personally. What is my fear? My fear is that we are already seeing the beginning of a militant, violent form of Christianity. And that it is just the most extreme end of a Christianity that, when measured against the heart of God in the Sermon on the Mount, has gone completely off the rails. That is my general fear. And my specific fear is that in the face of this massive crisis for the church, I don't make a difference. What I bring to the table isn't what anybody needs. And so I confess that fear to Jesus. And Jesus says, you don't think you make a difference. That's weird, because I'm pretty sure I designed you the way I did for a reason. So how about you just seek the kingdom in the unique way you were created to, and then don't worry about the rest. So, how do we... Oh, yeah. Jesus would give some version of that answer to every person in this room. So, how do we teach or preach the Sermon on the Mount, even in an election year? Confess your worry.
Perfect.
Give it to Jesus, and then go seek the kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Real Life Theology Podcast. We hope today's episode gave you fresh insight into the Sermon on the Mount and its call to heart transformation. If you want to dive deeper, check out Jeremy Bacon's book, Sermon on the Mount, 40 Days of Learning the Ways of the Kingdom. It's available on Amazon, or you can find it at renew.org. It's a great resource for anyone wanting to grow in understanding and living out Jesus' teachings. You can find it also in the show notes. Until next time, keep living out your faith in real life. Hope to see you guys next week.